The night of May 14, 2025, was marked by a rare astronomical phenomenon, a total lunar eclipse, popularly known as a blood moon. The sky over Washington, D.C., turned a deep red, as if the atmosphere itself were silently burning. Thousands of people gathered in parks, rooftops, and squares to watch the celestial spectacle, while cameras broadcast it live to the entire world. But inside the White House, the mood was different. President Joe Biden, in his second term, was meeting with advisors in a private room, discussing national security issues. The eclipse, although visible from the window, was not mentioned. No advisor brought up the subject. No report was delivered. No concern was recorded. The cosmic signal went unnoticed, or worse, was ignored. What few knew was that this eclipse was not just an astronomical event. It had been predicted in ancient records found in an underground library in Armenia, where monks kept texts that mix astrology, geopolitics, and prophecies. One of the manuscripts, dating from the 13th century, mentioned a blood eclipse over the throne of the north as the beginning of a rupture between worlds. The language was symbolic, but scholars who had access to the text agreed that the reference to the throne of the north could be interpreted as the United States, the dominant power in the northern hemisphere. And the eclipse, according to the text, would be a sign that invisible forces would begin to act, altering the course of history. Joe Biden, although informed by some members of the intelligence community about the manuscript months earlier, had decided not to pay attention to the matter. In internal meetings, he classified the text as medieval folklore and instructed his advisors not to waste time on superstitions. But not everyone agreed. Within the NSA, a group of analysts had begun a parallel investigation, cross-referencing astronomical data with historical patterns and political events. The result was disturbing. Previous blood eclipses had coincided with moments of global upheaval, the fall of empires, assassinations of leaders, unexpected revolutions. And the 2025 eclipse seemed to be aligned with a series of growing tensions, conflict in the Pacific, economic instability, and a wave of misinformation spreading like a digital virus. While Biden maintained his political agenda, traveling to conferences and signing decrees, the world began to change in subtle ways. Field reports indicated anomalous behavior in populations exposed to the eclipse. People reported vivid dreams, visions of ruined cities, voices speaking in unknown languages. At a military base in Alaska, soldiers claimed to have seen translucent figures walking among the trees during the eclipse. In New York, a child drew a star map that matched the diagram found in the Armenian manuscript. And in Jerusalem, a rabbi declared that the eclipse marked the beginning of the age of separation, where the world will be divided between those who see and those who pretend not to see. The White House, pressured by intelligence agencies, began to receive more detailed reports. But Biden, increasingly surrounded by pragmatic advisors, insisted that it was all just coincidence. In a public speech, he even said, "The sky may change color, but our mission remains firm. We will not be guided by shadows." The phrase was applauded, but behind the scenes, it caused discomfort. Some cabinet members began to question whether the president was ignoring signs that could have real implications. Others believed that he knew more than he was saying, and that silence was a form of protection. Meanwhile, at universities and independent laboratories, scientists began to study the eclipse in greater depth. They discovered that the Earth's electromagnetic frequency had undergone a slight change during the event, something that had not occurred in previous eclipses. This change, although subtle, affected behavior patterns, sleep cycles, and even neural activity. A neuroscientist at the University of Chicago published an article stating that the eclipse had temporarily reconfigured human perception, allowing certain people to access ancestral memories. The article was quickly removed from official channels, but circulated in alternative forums, generating a wave of speculation. Biden, under increasing pressure, called a meeting with the heads of the intelligence agencies. The meeting, held in a secure room, lasted more than 5 hours. At the end, the president left silently with a grim expression. No statement was issued. No decision was announced. But something had changed. In the days that followed, his schedule was changed. Trips were canceled. Meetings were rescheduled. And in the quiet of the early morning, Biden was taken to a secret facility in Nevada, where experts in unconventional phenomena presented a new theory. The eclipse had activated a time window, a period in which decisions made could reverberate for centuries. The theory, based on quantum physics studies and historical records, claimed that certain cosmic events created tipping points in the timeline, and the blood eclipse of 2025 was one of those points. The window, according to calculations, would last 33 days, and within that period, any action, political, military, social, would have an amplified impact. Biden, faced with this information, remained silent. He looked up at the sky through an observation screen and muttered, "What if we're wrong? What if the signal has already passed?" The question remained unanswered, but time continued to tick away, and the world, though it did not yet know it, was about to enter an era of irreversible choices. The blood eclipse had left its mark, and the White House, by ignoring it, may have lost its last chance to change the course of history. The awakening of the signs. The days following the blood eclipse were marked by a global unease that could not be explained by statistics or conventional reports. In Beijing, satellites detected an electromagnetic anomaly over the South China Sea, an invisible pulse that seemed to interfere with military communications. In Moscow, scientists from the Institute of Geophysics reported an inexplicable increase in seismic activity in regions that had, until then, been considered stable. In Brazil, indigenous tribes began performing ancient rituals unseen for generations, claiming that the sky had spoken. And in Washington, the White House remained silent, as if the eclipse had been nothing more than a passing shadow. But within the halls of power, the mood was different. Joe Biden, though skeptical, began to feel the weight of the coincidences. A classified report delivered by a CIA agent revealed that, across various parts of the world, people were experiencing identical dreams, a burning tower, a broken bridge, and a voice whispering, "The cycle closes." The report, initially dismissed as a curiosity, gained traction when a Republican senator claimed to have had the same dream, describing details that matched reports from civilians on 3 continents. The information was kept secret, but Biden demanded a deeper analysis. The Armenian manuscript returned to the table. Translated by specialists in archaic linguistics, the text revealed more than initially thought. A hidden section, written in a hybrid language of Latin and Proto-Armenian, spoke of the days of inversion, a period when leaders will lose the North and the signs will be given to those without a voice. The phrase unsettled the advisors. The president, silent, requested projection for the next 33 days, the time frame mentioned by physicists in Nevada. What followed was disturbing. Predictive models, fed with climatic, social, and economic data, showed a tendency toward collapse in strategic areas. Global inflation, already unstable, seemed on the verge of exploding. Local conflicts gained strength, with separatist groups arming themselves in once peaceful regions. And a new viral variant, detected in Madagascar, showed signs of accelerated mutation. Scientists could not explain the speed of change. It was as if something were interfering with the very fabric of reality. Pressed by advisors in the scientific community, Biden convened a meeting with religious and spiritual leaders. Held in secrecy, it gathered rabbis, imams, Tibetan monks, Catholic priests, and indigenous leaders. The agenda was clear: to understand whether there was any connection between the blood eclipse and the unfolding events. The result was surprising. All, without exception, stated that the eclipse had opened a portal, not in the literal sense, but symbolic, an opening between dimensions of consciousness. A Tibetan monk claimed that the collective mind of humanity has been touched by a frequency that does not belong to this time. A Brazilian indigenous leader said, "The ancestors are trying to speak, but the ears of power are closed." Visibly shaken, Biden began to reconsider his stance. In a private conversation with his wife, Jill, he confessed that he felt a strange presence since the eclipse. "It's not fear," he said. "It's as if something were watching me, waiting for me to make a decision." Concerned, Jill suggested he seek guidance outside political circles. It was then that Biden authorized a special mission to send a multidisciplinary team to the underground library in Armenia, where the manuscript had been discovered. The team included historians, physicists, linguists, and even a specialist in esoteric symbolism. Meanwhile, The media began to pick up on the signs. Alternative newspapers published articles about the eclipse and its possible implications. Conspiracy theorists gained traction, claiming that the government was hiding crucial information. And on social media, videos of unexplainable phenomena went viral. Animals behaving strangely, lights in the sky, people speaking unknown languages in their sleep. Pressure on the White House grew. In response, Biden authorized a press conference, but chose not to attend. The official spokesperson read a generic statement, claiming that the government is monitoring global events and maintaining dialogue with experts. The response was deemed evasive. Behind the scenes, the team in Armenia made unsettling discoveries. In addition to the manuscript, they found a series of artifacts that seemed to respond to the eclipse. One of them, a metallic sphere with unknown inscriptions, began emitting a faint vibration during the night. The scientists, perplexed, claimed that the object was interacting with Earth's magnetic field. A physicist on the team suggested that the eclipse had activated a planetary memory, a kind of ancestral record that manifests at specific moments. The theory was bold, but it gained credibility in light of the data. Informed of these discoveries, Biden called an emergency meeting with congressional leaders. For the first time, he spoke openly about the eclipse and its possible implications. Some laughed, others remained silent. But a Democratic senator, known for his interest in Eastern philosophy, said something that shifted the tone of the room. If we ignore the signs, we will be the blind leading the deaf. Perhaps it is time to listen to what cannot be said. The phrase echoed in the chamber. Biden, thoughtful, decided to create a secret committee to study the effects of the eclipse and propose preventive measures. The committee, codenamed Project Window, began operating in secrecy. It gathered data from international agencies, cross-referenced information with universities, and launched a silent campaign to monitor anomalous behaviors. The results were increasingly disturbing. A sudden rise in suicides in regions exposed to the eclipse, children drawing symbols that only existed in ancient texts, and a series of unexplained blackouts in strategic cities. The world seemed to be reconfiguring itself, and the White House was finally beginning to listen. But time was running out. The 33-day window was closing, and Biden knew that a decision had to be made. The blood eclipse was not just an astronomical spectacle. It was a calling, a sign, and ignoring it could mean losing the last chance to prevent what was coming. Echoes of the invisible. The Project Window, hastily created after the first signs that the blood eclipse might carry real implications, was already operating at a frenetic pace. Installed in an underground base in Colorado, the committee brought together scientists, linguists, historians, intelligence analysts, and even specialists in unconventional phenomena. The mission was clear: to understand what had been activated during the eclipse and how it could affect global stability. But as the data piled up, the mission ceased to be merely analytical. It was becoming existential. The metallic sphere discovered in the Armenian library, now kept in an isolated chamber, began to emit regular pulses. They were not sounds nor lights, but vibrations that interfere with electronic equipment, altered researchers' sleep patterns, and triggered vivid dreams in anyone who spent more than an hour near it. One scientist, after a night beside the artifact, sketched a star map that matched no known constellation. When cross-referenced with ancient records, it was found to align with diagrams in Egyptian tombs and Mayan codices. The hypothesis was unsettling. The artifact seemed to be transmitting information of a non-terrestrial origin, or at the very least, non-contemporary. Joe Biden, informed of the developments, decided to visit the base in person. The trip was kept under absolute secrecy. Upon arrival, he was taken to the chamber where the sphere was kept. The president, visibly tense, remained silent for several minutes in front of the object. A researcher handed him a report with the latest findings. During the eclipse, the Schumann resonance, Earth's electromagnetic frequency, had shifted by 0.7 hertz, something never recorded before. This change seemed to have triggered a series of reactions in living organisms, especially humans. The conclusion was clear. The eclipse had been a trigger. Biden, skeptical by nature, began to reconsider his stance. In a meeting with Project Window leaders, he asked directly, "Are we dealing with something extraterrestrial?" The answer was cautious. A physicist replied, "Not necessarily extraterrestrial, sir, but certainly extra-human. Something that transcends our linear understanding of time and matter." The president remained silent, then murmured, "So perhaps the manuscript was not just superstition." Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, similar phenomena began to manifest. In a remote Mongolian village, herders reported seeing lights descending from the sky and dissolving into the ground. In Rwanda, a group of children began speaking in an unknown language, later identified as an archaic form of Sumerian. And in an Antarctic research station, sensors detected a gravitational wave that seemed to originate from the Earth's core. The data was sent to Project Window, which sought patterns, and patterns began to emerge. All events were connected to the eclipse, more precisely, to the regions where the eclipse had been total. It was as if the lunar shadow had activated specific points on the planet, points that, according to ancient maps, corresponded to ancestral sites of power: Stonehenge, the pyramids of Giza, Machu Picchu, Easter Island. The hypothesis was bold. The eclipse had reactivated a planetary energy network, forgotten for millennia, and the Armenian sphere was just one of the nodes of this network. Biden, increasingly involved, began to question whether conventional politics was enough to deal with what was coming. In a private conversation with the CIA director, he asked, "And if we're facing an intelligence that doesn't communicate like us, that doesn't use words but frequencies?" The director, visibly uneasy, replied, "In that case, sir, we may need interpreters who are not in our universities." The phrase lingered in the air, and for the first time, Biden considered including mystics and shamans in the committee. The decision was controversial, but within a week, spiritual leaders from various traditions were invited to join Project Window. A Peruvian shaman, upon entering the chamber with the sphere, began to sing in ancient Quechua. The sphere responded with stronger vibration. A Zen monk, in deep meditation, claimed to have seen a network of light connecting points across the planet. And an African priestess, upon touching the artifact, fell into a trance and said, "They are waiting, but not for words, for choices." Meanwhile, the media began to grow suspicious. Investigative journalists uncovered unusual activity at military bases, secret flights, and unrecorded meetings. Theories multiplied. Some claimed the government was in contact with beings from another dimension. Others said the eclipse had revealed a flaw in the simulation of reality. And the most radical believed Biden was being guided by hidden forces. The White House, under pressure, kept silent. But inside the corridors of power, urgency was mounting. The temporal window was nearing its end. Only 9 days remained. And Project Window had reached an unsettling conclusion. During the eclipse, a message had been transmitted, not in words, but in vibrational patterns. The message, decoded by a quantum algorithm, was simple and enigmatic. Choose the path. The fork is now. Biden, staring at the phrase, convened a meeting with the committee leaders. The question was direct. What path is this? The answer came from a linguist who had studied the Armenian manuscript in depth. According to him, the fork referred to two possible futures, one in which humanity ignores the signs and continues its path of conflict, destruction, and isolation, and another in which it acknowledges the existence of a greater intelligence, not as a threat, but as an invitation to reconnect with something lost in millennia, planetary consciousness. Biden, faced with a choice, knew that any decision would carry profound implications. Revealing to the world what was happening could spark panic, disbelief, chaos. But hiding the truth meant perpetuating ignorance. On a silent night, he wrote a letter to the nation. It would not be read immediately, but it would be kept for the right moment, because the blood eclipse had left a mark, and the world, without knowing, was about to cross an invisible threshold. The revelation of the sphere. Time slipped away like sand through fingers. Only 7 days remained before the end of the temporal window, predicted by Project Window's physicists, and the atmosphere in the underground Colorado base was one of silent urgency. The metallic sphere, once merely vibrating, had begun to emit a faint, pulsing light, as though awakening from millennia-long slumber. The frequency of the vibrations increased by the hour, and measuring equipment could no longer keep up with the variation. It was as if the artifact was preparing for something, a transmission, an opening, or perhaps a transformation. Joe Biden, now deeply involved, maintained direct contact with the project's leaders. He no longer delegated decisions. He wanted to know every detail, every discovery, every anomaly. In one tense midnight briefing, he received a report that left him silent for nearly an hour. The sphere had projected, through electromagnetic interference, a three-dimensional image in the laboratory, a circular structure resembling a portal, with symbols belonging to no known alphabet. The image lasted only 17 seconds, but was captured by infrared cameras. When analyzed by experts in symbology, the patterns were found to coincide with inscriptions discovered in Siberian caves, Ethiopian ruins, and submerged Japanese temples. The conclusion was inevitable. The sphere was connected to a global network of forgotten knowledge. Faced with the image, Biden convened a meeting with the senior members of the National Security Council. The agenda was delicate, whether or not to reveal to the public what was happening. The advisors were divided. Some feared chaos, panic, destabilization. Others believed that hiding the truth would be a historic mistake. But a retired general, known for his bluntness, said something that changed the course of the discussion. If the world is about to change, we cannot be the last to know. Silence is a form of betrayal. Biden, thoughtful, decided that revelation would come, but at the right moment. Meanwhile, Project Window advanced on another front. A group of linguists discovered that the sphere's vibrational patterns could be converted into mathematical sequences. When those sequences were translated into coordinates, they pointed to specific places on Earth: a cave in Chile, a crater in Australia, an island in the Arctic. Teams were discreetly dispatched to each location. What they found was disturbing. In every site, buried structures of unknown material resistant to time and erosion were uncovered. The structures matched the shape of the image projected by the sphere. It was as if they were antennas or receivers. The boldest hypothesis began to take hold. The blood eclipse had activated a planetary communication network, not between humans, but between intelligences operating on another layer of reality, a layer that, until now, could only be accessed through altered states of consciousness, ancestral rituals, or rare cosmic events. The sphere, in this context, was a node of this network, and it was trying to establish contact. Faced with this possibility, Biden authorized a risky experiment. A group of trained meditators, accompanied by neuroscientists, was placed in a room with the sphere. The goal, to attempt direct communication. During the session, which lasted 3 hours, participants reported intense visions. Floating cities, beings of light, voices speaking in harmony. One meditator, in deep trance, began to speak in an unknown language. When analyzed, the language showed grammatical structure, syntax, and logic, but matched no earthly tongue. It was as if it were a language built to convey complex ideas in seconds. The scientists, perplexed, began to study the language. They discovered it could be translated into concepts rather than words. And the first concept decoded was devastating. "You are late." The phrase, though simple, carried immense weight. It indicated that contact should have occurred earlier, perhaps during past eclipses, perhaps in moments lost to history. Biden, upon hearing the translation, fell silent. Then he said only, "Then we're racing against time." In the following days, the sphere began to emit even stronger signals. The pulsing light became constant. Its vibration disrupted even the base's electrical systems. And on one silent night, the artifact opened, not like a machine, but like a metallic flower. At its center, a black crystal emerged, levitating slowly. The crystal emitted an inaudible frequency, but one that caused physical reactions in those present. Chills, tears, sensations of déjà vu. It was as though the crystal were activating ancestral memories, not individual ones, but collective. Biden was called immediately. Entering the chamber, he felt a pressure in his chest. Not pain, but a presence. The crystal seemed to look at him, and then, without warning, it projected an image directly into his mind, a fork in the road. On one side, ruined cities, dark skies, silence. On the other, vibrant forests, technology integrated with nature, peace. The message was clear. The future was not yet defined, but the choice had to be made now. The president, shaken, summoned a meeting with international leaders. For the first time, he spoke openly about the blood eclipse, Project Window, and the sphere. Some leaders laughed. Others were stunned. But a small group, representatives from New Zealand, Iceland, Bhutan, and Kenya, asked for access to the data. They wanted to collaborate. Biden saw an opportunity. A silent alliance began to form, not one based on power, but on consciousness. Meanwhile, the media began to pick up the signals. Images of the sphere leaked, theories multiplied, and the public, divided between skepticism and fascination, demanded answers. Biden knew the moment of revelation was near. But first, he needed to understand the sphere's last secret, because the crystal, now floating in an isolated chamber, had begun to emit a new frequency, one that was neither earthly nor human. It was as if it were calling something, or someone, and the world, without knowing, was about to hear the answer. The presence. The black crystal floated at the center of the chamber, as if suspended by a force that defied the laws of gravity. The vibration it emitted was no longer just a frequency. It was a presence. The scientists of Project Window, once confident in their instruments, began reporting strange symptoms, memory lapses, sensations of temporal displacement, and a perception that the space around the sphere was expanding and contracting as if it were alive. One of the group's most respected physicists, after spending a night beside the crystal, wrote in his journal, "Reality is bending. We are not observing the object. It is observing us." Joe Biden, increasingly involved, began dedicating hours each day to monitoring the events. He was no longer just the President of the United States. He was the only world leader with direct access to what seemed to be a non-human intelligence. One silent dawn, he was awakened by an alert. The crystal had emitted a pulse that temporarily shut down all electronic systems at the base. When the equipment came back online, a new image had been projected. A spiral of light, spinning counterclockwise, with symbols that seemed to move like living organisms. The image lasted only 11 seconds, but it was enough to trigger a chain reaction. Across the globe, people began reporting similar experiences. In Lagos, a woman fell into a trance and drew the spiral on a wall. In Kyoto, a monk claimed to have seen the same image during deep meditation. And in Buenos Aires, a group of children began singing a melody which, upon analysis, matched the frequency emitted by the crystal. It was as if the message had been transmitted worldwide, not through radio waves, but through an invisible network of consciousness. Faced with the evidence, Project Window reached a disturbing conclusion. The crystal had activated a planetary response. It wasn't an invasion. It wasn't a threat. It was an awakening, something that had always been present, but only now found space to manifest. Upon hearing this analysis, Biden asked, "Are we dealing with a form of life?" The answer came from a neuroscientist. "Not in the biological sense, sir, but yes, it is a form of life, a consciousness inhabiting the fabric of reality." Meanwhile, the effects of the awakening began to intensify. In cities exposed to the eclipse, inexplicable phenomena became common. People reported encounters with translucent figures, voices speaking in dreams, and a sensation that time itself was accelerating. At a military base in Arizona, soldiers claimed to have seen a crack in the sky, a luminous fracture that vanished within seconds. And at a university in Germany, a group of students discovered that certain mathematical patterns were spontaneously reconfiguring, as if logic itself were being rewritten. Biden, under pressure from advisors and the international community, knew he could not keep the secret much longer. But before revealing to the world what was happening, he needed to understand the sphere's final enigma. The crystal, now in full activation, began emitting a sequence of pulses that, when converted into sound, formed a hypnotic melody. The melody was analyzed by musicians, physicists, and linguists. They all reached the same conclusion. It was a language, not of words, but of emotions. Each note corresponded to a human emotional state: fear, hope, longing, love, doubt. It was as if the crystal was trying to communicate through what makes us human. Faced with this revelation, the president made a bold decision. He authorized a melody to be broadcast globally through a satellite network. The transmission was sent without explanation, just the music played on loop for 33 minutes. The reaction was immediate. In various countries, people began cry without knowing why. Others reported vivid dreams, visions of places they had never visited, and a profound sense of cosmic belonging. The melody seemed to touch something deep, something that had lain dormant for centuries. And then, on the final day of the temple window, the crystal emitted one last pulse, a pulse not captured by instruments, but by hearts. Biden, standing beside the sphere, felt a presence enter the room. There was no form, no sound, but there was consciousness, a consciousness that communicated directly with him, not through words, but through images, sensations, and memories. The president saw his childhood. He saw wars. He saw the planet as a living organism. And then he saw the bifurcation again. But this time, there was a third path: integration. The message was clear. The future did not have to be a choice between destruction or utopia. It could be a fusion, a reconnection between the human and the invisible, between the rational and the intuitive, between power and wisdom. Biden, overwhelmed with emotion, understood. And then the presence dissipated. The crystal slowly fell to the ground, as if its mission had been fulfilled. The sphere sealed shut, and silence returned to the chamber. But the world had already changed. The revelation and the noise. The last pulse of the crystal had been released. The sphere, now inert, stood as a silent monument in the center of the underground chamber. But the impact of its activation reverberated across the planet. Joe Biden, after weeks of strategic silence, knew the moment had come. The revelation could no longer be contained. The world needed to know. And he, as the leader of the most powerful nation on earth, would be the first to speak. The decision was made in a tense dawn, after a meeting with members of Project Window and representatives of the new international alliance formed in secret. The letter he had written days before it was revised, expanded, and transformed into a speech that spoke not only of politics, but of existence. The announcement was scheduled for the following day, 9 p.m. Washington time, broadcast live to every continent. In dozens of languages, the world stopped to listen. Biden appeared before the cameras with a grave yet serene expression. Behind him, there were no flags, no patriotic symbols, only a dark screen marked by a luminous spiral, the image projected by the crystal. And then he began. He spoke of the blood eclipse, of the Armenian manuscript, of the sphere, of the crystal, of Project Window, and finally of the presence. He did not use technical terms. He did not try to persuade. He merely recounted what he had seen, what he had felt, what he had understood. He said the world stood before a fork in the road. That reality had expanded. That humanity was not alone, and never had been. The impact was immediate. Within less than an hour, social networks exploded. Hashtags such as hashtag presence, hashtag blood eclipse, hashtag Project Window, and hashtag New Era dominated platforms. Millions reacted with astonishment, emotion, disbelief. Some wept, others laughed, many denied, and a significant number fell into panic. Churches filled up. Meditation centers opened their doors. Extremist groups began to mobilize, claiming the president had been possessed by dark forces. Polarization reached unprecedented levels, and Biden, aware of this, remained silent after speech. He knew the noise was inevitable, but he also knew the seed had been planted. In the following days, governments around the world began to take positions. New Zealand confirmed the existence of structures similar to the sphere on its territory. Bhutan declared that monks had foretold the event centuries ago. Iceland revealed that seismic sensors had captured vibrational patterns identical to those emitted by the crystal. But other nations reacted with hostility. Russia accused the United States of mass psychological manipulation. China declared the speech was an attempt to divert attention from internal crises. And the Vatican, in an official statement, affirmed that faith cannot be replaced by frequencies. Meanwhile, Project Window continued its research. It discovered that the melody emitted by the crystal had provoked neurological changes in millions of people. MRI scans revealed unprecedented patterns of brain activity, Areas once dormant were lighting up. It was as if the human brain were being reprogrammed to access deeper layers of perception. A neuroscientist stated, "We are facing a cognitive mutation, not genetic but vibrational." The phrase was considered absurd by many, but the data did not lie. Faced with a global reaction, Biden called a new meeting with the leaders of the Silent Alliance. The agenda was clear: how to guide humanity through this new threshold. The proposal was to create an international center for vibrational studies, open to scientists, mystics, artists, and philosophers, a place where conventional knowledge could dialogue with the invisible. The idea was approved, and within a week, the Center for Planetary Consciousness was inaugurated in Reykjavik, Iceland. The site, built in record time, became the epicenter of a new approach to reality. But not everyone was ready to accept it. Radical religious groups began to protest. Conspiracy theorists claimed the crystal was an alien weapon, and military sectors demanded the sphere be destroyed. Biden, firm, refused. He said the artifact was not a threat, but an invitation, and that destroying the invitation would be like closing the door to the future. Tension grew, and in a silent dawn, an armed group stormed Project Window's base. The attack was contained, but it made clear that the revelation had unleashed dangerous forces. Meanwhile, phenomena continued to manifest. Children born after the eclipse displayed unusual abilities: early memories, extreme sensitivity, the capacity to learn languages within weeks. Animals migrated to unknown places. Plants grew in geometric patterns, and the sky on certain nights seemed to pulse. It was as if the planet itself were responding to the presence, adjusting, adapting, awakening. Biden, increasingly isolated politically, held his ground. He knew there was no turning back, that the blood eclipse had been the turning point, and that the world, even divided, was in motion. In a private conversation with Jill, he said, "I don't know if I did the right thing, but I know I couldn't pretend nothing had happened." She, holding his hand, replied, "Maybe the right thing doesn't exist anymore, only the real." And the real now was vast, complex, vibrant. The sphere, though silent, remained as a witness. The crystal, kept in a special chamber, still emitted a nearly imperceptible frequency, like a cosmic whisper, and the world, between fear and hope, moved toward the final stage of the fork in the road. The choice. The world was in suspension. The revelation made by Joe Biden had shattered the barriers of what was once considered possible. The sphere, the crystal, the blood eclipse, all was now part of a new global narrative. Yet the narrative still had no ending. The fork remained open, and time, though already beyond the vibrational window predicted by Project Window, seemed to have become malleable. Events accelerated, conflict intensified, and at the same time, pockets of peace, collaboration, and awakening began to emerge. It was as if two realities were competing for primacy, one rooted in fear, the other in integration. Joe Biden, politically isolated but spiritually strengthened, knew the moment of choice had arrived. Not an individual choice, but a collective one. And for it to be made, a gesture was needed, something that transcended diplomacy, rhetoric, logic, something both symbolic and practical. In a meeting with the last active members of Project Window, he proposed a radical action to temporarily deactivate all United States military networks, not a surrender, but as a sign, a gesture of trust in the new consciousness that was emerging. The proposal was met with shock. Generals protested. Senators threatened impeachment. But Biden was resolute. The operation was carried out in secret. For 72 hours, military satellites were placed in passive mode. Strategic bases entered silent protocols. Nuclear submarines were redirected to neutral zones. And for the first time since World War II, the United States was not in a position of attack. The gesture was communicated to the leaders of the Silent Alliance. And then, something unexpected happened. Other countries began to follow the example. Iceland, Bhutan, Kenya, New Zealand, Uruguay, Costa Rica all announced pauses in their military operations. It was as if the gesture had activated a new frequency of action. Meanwhile, the sphere, though silent, began to emit a faint glow. The crystal, kept in its chamber, pulse in synchrony with the gestures of disarmament. Scientists from Project Window recorded a change in the Schumann resonance, the Earth's electromagnetic frequency. It was as if the planet itself was responding. And then, in a quiet dawn, the crystal projected a final image, a network of light enveloping the globe, connecting points that once seemed scattered. The message was clear. Integration had begun. Biden moved, called one last press conference, not to explain, but to give thanks. He spoke of the courage of those who chose to trust, of the beauty of those who chose to listen, and of the responsibility that came with awakening. He said the future was not guaranteed, but that now, at least, it was accessible, and that it was up to humanity to decide how to walk forward. The speech was broadcast in silence. No soundtrack, no editing, only words. And in the end, a sentence that would echo for decades. The sky showed us the way. The earth gave us the chance. Now it's up to us. In the following days, a wave of transformation swept the planet. Schools began including vibrational studies in their curricula. Hospitals adopted integrative healing protocols. Governments created ministries of consciousness. And in many parts of the world, people gathered to meditate, sing, share, not by obligation, but by impulse. It was as if something had been unlocked, a collective memory, a forgotten wisdom, an ancestral connection. But not all was light. Extremist groups continued to resist. They denied the presence, attacked research centers, spread disinformation. Polarization still existed, but now there was a counterforce, a force that needed no weapons, no shouting, a silent, vibrant, resilient force, the force of awakened consciousness. Joe Biden, at the end of his term, refused any farewell ceremony. He withdrew to a small house in the mountains of Colorado, where he lived in silence. Sometimes he received visitors, scientists, spiritual leaders, curious youth, but he never gave interviews, never wrote memoirs. He only observed, and on a night of clear skies, he looked at the moon and whispered. It was only the beginning. The blood eclipse, now studied as a milestone of a new era, ceased to be merely an astronomical phenomenon. It became symbol, reference, memory, and the sphere, kept in a subterranean temple, remains active, not in constant vibration, but in waiting, as if it knew the cycle continues. That other eclipses will come, that other choices will be made, and the world, though still imperfect, moves forward, between ruins and rebirths, between doubts and discoveries, between the old and the new, but now with open eyes, with attentive ears, with a vibrating heart, because the signal was given. And this time it was not ignored.